Okay, so whoever's watching, thank you for joining us. My name is Henry L. Sullivan III. I am author of the novel Colosseum.
And I am Christine Madera, and I am the author of the novel God and Drag. And this is our first live conversation on here, although we had another one previously, and you can find that on Henry's Substack page, where we talked about books and lots of other things.
Yes. So the first thing that I thought it would be good to go through is if you can talk a little bit about the quote that inspired the title of this live stream. So,
Yeah.
the title is the finger pointing at America is not America, but that comes from another quote.
Right, and it came from a quote out of our last conversation, and the quote was, "The finger pointing at the moon is not the moon." And the meaning behind that quote, I think it's a Buddhist quote, and it's basically that the moon being like consciousness or God or the universe or whatever, but whatever that is, the finger pointing at whatever that idea or level of consciousness is not what that is. So, in the context of what we were talking about before, the finger pointing at the moon was not the moon meant the finger pointing at God was not the religion that's trying to claim God as or trying to define God. And it's a wonderful quote because so often, as humans, we try to control our lives by defining things. Because once we have a definition of something, then we can contain it, we can control it, we can try to compare it to other people, we can own it, and but then we have arguments over the fingers pointing at the moon. But that was the basic quote, and it's one that has, if you think about it too much, it gets confusing. But if you kind of let it flow through you, it makes perfect sense.
Oh yeah, it does make perfect sense, and I think it's a real useful way of thinking about a lot of things. And
Hmm.
so the reason why it made sense to me in terms of America is because at least I personally watch a lot of media in which the people in the videos purport to explain or in some cases literally tell the audience what America is.
Hmm.
And it would be based on polling or based on analysis or historical
Yeah.
information or whatever. And I think it's kind of good, especially with the United States of America, because it's such a large, complicated country that it's good to sort of keep in remember that there is a United States of America out there that exists. And then there's this conversation that people are having about America. The degree to which the two are the same can vary a lot.
It does, and I think, kind of like the universe for life or whatever, the United States of America is so big and so huge, and we've had a 250 plus year history, because we had a lot of
Mhm.
history before we became an official country, that we're not definable. In
Mhm.
the same way that you might want to define something that's small. Like there's so many layers to it. There's so many aspects and ways of looking at it. And in a way, I mean, the United States of America is kind of like the United States of Americans. Like everybody has had their unique experience, and they're all valid experiences, and not everybody has the same experience. And to say, well, my experience is valid and your experience isn't valid, to completely reduces the experience of America down to this very small, tiny little narrative like they try to do in news shows, because if you can
Mhm.
control the narrative, you can control the news and control the people watching the news. And to me, all of that, telling one story of what America is and trying to make everything fit into that and saying, well, then that's not America. That's not American. You're not American. You're not a real American or whatever
Mhm.
is kind of that way to divide and conquer, to define and conquer and eliminate and exclude.
I totally agree. And I am sympathetic to the voices that say, well, we need a new story for America in order to unify the country. I'm sympathetic to that perspective. But at the same time, I think that what you just said it was 100% true that there were so many different people in this country, 330 million people, and we're all coming at it from such different perspectives that
Mhm.
that's a huge challenge. And, I have an idea that I'd like to throw by you.
Okay.
And it's based on something. Do you remember pen pals? Do you remember that when we were
Okay, so
kids?
oh, yeah, you mean actual pen pals where you'd write back and forth?
Yeah, when we were kids.
Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah, and
remember.
and one of the things, in retrospect, it was a long for me, it was a long time ago.
Yeah, way before Facebook and everything else where you can just message
Exactly.
people. Yeah.
Back when people actually wrote letters, you know.
Yes.
But one of the things that, in retrospect, I don't know whether in reality this is a memory that I had when I was a kid,
Mhm,
but looking back at it, one of the things that seemed really special about pen pals is that you had this person, you're a little kid,
mhm,
and your teacher introduces you to this idea that there are other little kids somewhere else that you probably will never meet face to face,
mhm.
and those other little kids would love to hear from you, like hear things from
Yeah.
you. And wouldn't you like to talk to them, write them a letter? And to me, one of the wonderful things about that is as a little kid, the thing that you're going to put in your letter is what's important to you, what's special
Mhm.
to you. So if you
Yeah.
have a special doll or a special ball or a pet, or if one of your parents or both of your parents are special, or your grandparents or your neighborhood, or if you're on a team, that's what you're going to
Mhm.
write about. And so you write it down in a letter, and then you mail it to this kid, you put it in the mailbox, and then you get a bunch of letters back. And in the letter that you get back, the other kid basically does the same thing.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's this way of sharing what's special in the kid world, which is
Mhm.
another way of saying what's valuable. It's a way of
Mhm.
sharing with other people what's valuable to you. So to kind of present this idea, what I'd like to start off with is what I would like to be the outcome. Okay, so the outcome of this idea is to have people make videos, just like we're making a video right now, and
Mhm.
they state what they value, what's important to them from all over the United States of America. And it's they may not be thinking of this, but
Mhm.
what I want this program to do is to basically trigger a theological slash ethical imagination, which is
Mhm.
something that we really don't use very much right
No.
now.
Yeah.
Right now, platforms like this are really good at incentivizing vice, really good
Right. 'Cause
at
that you get more
incentivizing
likes and
vice.
shares. Yeah.
Yeah,
Totally.
exactly. But it's not very good at incentivizing virtue.
Well, you know,
What's that?
or being thoughtful about an idea,
Or
it's
being
all about,
thought.
like, how do you create a reaction, not how do you have a conversation or provoke a thought to think about and really go deep and ponder that for yourself and for
Exactly.
others. Yeah.
Exactly. So just like how, most kids probably didn't think, you know what, I'd like to write a letter to some kid I've never met before. There was an actual program that
Uh-huh.
encouraged them to do that. And
Yeah.
so the program that I have in mind that encourage people to share what they value would be a program that involves two sides to it. One would be the old fashioned theologian or
Mhm.
ethicist, so to make it where it's not necessarily religious, it could be secular,
Mhm.
but have the kind of people. And as a writer, I'm sure you can relate to this. I just personally believe that
Uh-huh.
writing is the best way to sharpen ideas.
Oh, absolutely.
You document your ideas, you test your ideas, someone else writes something, in response to what you've written that
Mhm.
forces you to think about what you've written and to think about what they've written is very different from speaking, because speaking is just kind of right there in a moment, and you're using all these other different things to make what you're saying powerful. You can use the way you dress, you can use your tone of voice, you can use like the response you get from an audience, you can use all kind of things to make something that content wise is actually really weak seem really strong.
Well, I just wanna comment on that before we pass that one by because I totally agree with that, and yet I think people who are verbal processors like me, I'm not sure if you are or not,
Hmm.
the cultivation of ideas through real conversation, not through like talking head, talking
Yeah.
at people, but that
Hmm.
actual, "Well, tell me more about that." "Well, I might think about that for a little bit." So it doesn't have to it's not content driven in the sense that you have to have a talking point after talking point after talking point,
Hmm.
but that you have exploration and, moving through things like that can be really helpful as well for helping people work through their ideas. Because sometimes when it's locked in your own head, I
Hmm.
know this for me, like, I will sometimes have to go with even when I'm writing, have to go with like a call and response in my writing and challenge my own writing in a back and forth conversation way. Because for me, those questions back are the things that really excavate for it, deeper information. So, but I also use the writing. So I think different people work in different ways, but we have lost the art of conversation as well in
What I
terms of conversation to take you deeper versus talking at each other or trying to prove your point.
That is true, and so it sounds like you're describing the writing group method, you know, so
Yeah,
you
kinda like that, yeah.
yeah, you present a section of your writing to the group, and then they critique it. Yeah, I'm very familiar with that, and I totally agree with you. But I still think my idea is that that actually gets to the other side of it. So my idea is you have like the old-fashioned sit in a tower, knock out your ideas. A lot of it is just abstraction, and
Mhm,
then you publish that text, and then
mhm,
someone else is doing the same thing from a different perspective, and they're all being reviewed together in the context of this project.
mhm,
But I also imagine that after you publish that, the person who publishes that text will want to dialogue about that text. Will want to
yeah,
talk about it. Kind of the
publicly.
way, investigative reporters will publish this, 7,000 word
Yeah,
article in like the Atlantic or something. And then they'll go on all these different podcasts and on cable news and talk about it, basically,
yeah,
right? To make it more accessible to people. But the other side of it though is you actually have the people from these communities. So the
mhm,
theologian is ostensibly representing a particular community, be it, mainline Christians or evangelical Christians or Catholics or Muslim or
mhm,
Jewish or Judaism or Islam. And so what you can do is you can connect those people to actual communities which
mhm,
have leaders who are doing the speaking. That's the main thing that they do.
okay,
So you have preachers and rabbis and, you just have all of these people,
mhm,
community leaders who are actually in the community, engaging with the community. And you connect the writer or the theologian or the
mhm,
ethicist with the community that's related to what they're arguing. And that way, that whole enterprise, that whole project will
mhm,
encourage people. I'm imagining, like you throw water into a pond and you have this ripple effect. That's what I'm imagining would
okay,
happen is you'll have a ripple effect. And so some of the people like in a church in a small town somewhere probably has never read the stuff written by the theologian who is representing supposedly their values,
right,
but they've had this ripple effect. They've heard about this project, it has a
mhm,
name that's catchy and they want to be basically they've been encouraged to express virtue, to even
mhm.
think, about their values in that way. And they want to make a statement about it. And so that's my idea. I'm just curious what you think of that.
Well, I think it's an interesting idea. It's interesting we're just talking about it right in here, but I think also part of this, especially when you bring up like theology with this, is one of the things about theology is it supports a worldview. It lays out this is how we view the world and how the virtues that we bring to this world and what fits into this world, what doesn't fit into this world. And oftentimes, people within their own theology, if they haven't experienced something outside of it that asks other questions, not in a confrontational way, but
Hmm.
in a probing way to understand one another, that you don't really look at and analyze, the fundamentals of your worldview from a contrasting perspective. So let me give you an example. When I was a kid, I knew don't talk about all the experiences that brought this about, but I knew that I was having a really limited experience. I was a suburban kid growing up in LA area. My family had been in the United States on most sides since like the 1600s. So I didn't have like an old country that I had traditions from. I was kind of a mainstream sort of person and I knew it was limiting and I couldn't. So I would try to talk to people who were different than me, but I would go and really look up rule book encyclopedias. And other cultures, and I would imagine I was a kid in that culture, and I was having, like, imaginary pen friends from this place because asking them, about their culture and, like, "Well, what's school like for you?" And I'm kinda look it up and I use part of my imagination. I don't know how accurate I was, but really looking at the contrast illuminated for me my life in a way that I couldn't see. Like, if there's no mirror, you can't see what you're looking at. If you've always been, well, this is the way it's always been for me. I believe this, and this because this is what I've always been told, and I've never really had to have a mirror pointed at it to know why I feel that way, or if I really
Hmm.
feel that way, or if it's just kind of the talking points I grew up with, and that's what's coded in my nervous system, and so that's what I believe. So I think one of the aspects that we might bring to something like this are perhaps some probing questions that people can work from to be
Mm,
able to look at, well, what is it that I value, and then why do I value that? What's the structure that I learn those values from? And have I ever come across another structure that's given me a different set of values, and how have I incorporated that or not incorporated that? Like, I've lived in several different countries, so I've had lots of different values coming at me and not been afraid of the idea that, oh, somebody else has, the Japanese have a whole different value, and, it's not wrong, it's not right, it's just different. And it helped to illuminate for me, one of many different places, and help clarify, oh, this is why this is important to me. And oh, I can see why this is important to them. And wow, that's really kind of cool. And so I would incorporate some of those things for myself. So I think part of this could really be helpful to give people, whether questions or a format or something, or conversation partners, to be able to have some mirroring experience so that it's not just me talking from my surface level self,
mhm.
but it is, really doing some inner investigation and inner thoughtfulness and understanding the context in which my values were created and testing those values and then coming forth and saying, yeah, this is what I think I really value. And then connecting people, because I'm all about the connection, right? So then connecting
Mhm.
people with communities, or even people who are not necessarily of the same community, but maybe have similar values
Mhm.
that they have from a different experience.
Well, okay, that's interesting. So it sounds like the thing you've added to my idea is the notion of a prompt. So in other words,
Yeah.
instead of just
Or
leaving it
oh,
free, leaving it open where you can say whatever you want to say, what you're saying is have a prompt at least
or
every.
a couple of sets of prompts, that take,
Mm-hmm.
you ever heard of that thing about, the why? There's this question, I believe this. Well, why do you believe that? Well, I believe that because, well, then why that because? So when you go down 5 or 6 or 7 layers of why, you've
Mm-hmm.
really looked at, like, you've really had to look at, why is that? Is it because I was just always told that? Or have I had personal experiences that have validated that for me?
Mm.
Maybe giving a prompt and then prompting people to go through 5 or 6 or 10 or 50 layers of why, depending on the person. Some people 3 layers, like, that's what they're gonna do, and some people, like, that becomes a rabbit hole and they really dig deep. So, maybe a prompt and, asking, those why questions for 5 or 6 rounds to really begin to look toward that, the root of those values rather than just what you think those values are.
No, I totally see what you're saying. So yeah, that I think is definitely a good idea. So my thinking is the name that I like for this is the National Community Center. I mean, because the times that I've been exposed to a community center, I've always been struck by how like you walk into this building and you can sort of see all the different programs that
Mhm.
are being held in that community center. And they can be very disparate. So you can have like,
Yeah,
you can have a program for kids where on in this particular room you see all the little art that the kids were encouraged to make
yeah.
for, for this particular class. It happens on Saturday morning at 10 a.m. or
Mhm,
something like that. And then you can see like the schedule for whatever teams are connected to this community center. You
mhm.
can also see like maybe different things related to like the senior citizen program. It's all kind of stacked in the corner, all ready to go for when the people who participate in that like come to the community center and do whatever it is they're doing. Some people, you might even have some kind of worship ceremonies on different days of the week in the very same community center. That's the reason why that idea, that name really makes sense to me.
Yeah. You could even have, like, a little subtitle, like, "The Stories of America."
Yeah,
And,
exactly.
because I think any story, because I've heard that as well, "We need a new story." Well, okay. But a new story, oftentimes is aspirational that sort of leaves out all the messy parts. And
Mhm.
any true story of America has to include all of America, just like any true, reckoning of me. Like if I look at myself, I have to look at all of myself. I can't just look at the parts that I think, well, I like that, I like that, I like that, but all the other stuff, put it under the rug. Because I mean, I was a hypnotherapist. That stuff comes out, and it comes out in negative ways, and we're seeing that now. All the things that we've kind of repressed or ignored or sort of glossed over are sort of in technicolor now. So any new story of America really needs to include the story of Americans and then the history of those stories, because over 250 plus years, we have those layers of values that have grown since the very beginning. And so I
Mhm.
think if we can be open and inclusive of all of our stories, and that whatever our primary overarching story is going forward makes room for all Americans and all people who have experienced America, even if they're immigrants, or
Yeah, no. Well, there are a couple of things that come to mind for me hearing you say that. So one thing is I actually firmly believe that if you give people the like if your prompt is what do you value? And you kind of make it and sort of wrapped around that prompt is the notion of virtuous values. Like
Mhm,
the person feels compelled to say something positive, right?
mhm.
I think most people will say essentially the same thing about like compassion and caring and all that kind of stuff because it seems as though all of the faith traditions all
Mhm.
wind up in the same place, even if they don't start at the same place. They always wind up in a place
Yeah, they have a
where
very similar message, yeah.
very similar message. So that's one thing. The other thing, though, that you touched on that I feel is definitely true right now is for the longest time, I think that there was a narrative that few people felt compelled to reject. Oh, the whole idea of you have this colony that where the citizens are being mistreated and they get really angry, and they're angry at the king and they don't want a monarchy anymore and they want a country that's run by the people. And so they throw tea into the water, and all that kind of stuff.
Our rebel story, our original rebel story,
Well, I
yeah.
think is I think is the reason why you can, in the US, I believe when you use the word revolution, people just assume that it means positive. It's a positive thing, whereas revolution just
Yeah,
means overthrow of the existing power.
right, right.
So
No, that's true, it's
if
true,
you
and
like
one
these
thing we forget is that even back in the day, it was split 50-50. I mean, it kind of is the same way it was now. It wasn't like everybody wanted to oust the king. It
right,
was
exactly.
half did and half the people didn't, and it was a pretty slim dividing line about how that got sorted out.
Yeah, if you like the power, then you don't think revolution is a good thing.
No, no, not at all. Um,
But I think that we're in a moment right now where authenticity kind of has a certain premium. And so you
mhm,
touched on this when you were saying that the story needs to include a kind of grittiness. And so, the story that I just told, those of us of a certain age, because I actually think that people below a certain age may not necessarily be familiar with that story. I mean, where would they get it?
right,
It's
I know.
like, yeah, it's like, we got that story from all different things that were just present in our society, like Sesame Street and all this other
Mhm.
stuff. That's all gone.
Yeah, yeah.
But I
And
think that
growing up where you had, like, I remember when I was going to school, most of my teachers were either hippies or Vietnam vets, and
hmm,
then the administration who were older were often, remembered World War II and occasionally World War One.
hmm,
And so they had a whole different narrative and expectation of what life was and what
hmm.
America was within that, was part of my formative years that I think, you look at kids now and who the teachers are, what their experiences are, and what was important then are coming up with entirely different stories. And I'm sure, like, my mom, whose parents went through the Great Depression or World War One, and the late well, I guess weren't alive in the 1800s, but from their parents, they would have gotten different stories. So you've got this, long generational shift about different groups or different age groups really having a different understanding of America generally.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that in a way, because that's the story that we're sort of both agreeing we were told for the longest
Mhm.
time is a very backward looking story. You
Mhm.
know, it's a
Yeah.
story where the things that happened were hundreds of years ago, so they're very distant from you. Whereas I actually do believe that for the story, a new story to resonate with Americans, it needs to feel present and future, not just the
Mhm.
past.
Right.
And in terms of that grittiness, I don't know that stories necessarily has to be, or for it to resonate with the broadest group of people, that it necessarily has to be so noble sounding.
No, I think that is not you're right, 'cause there's a sense, when you ignore all of the realities of life and you're just like, "Oh, we're just gonna look at the shining light on a hill,"
Hmm.
it's not authentic, and if we can actually sit with the idea that, and we all do this individually, I hope, or we've all had the experience of, like, there's parts of me that I regret. There's things I've done that I regret, and there's things that I've done that have been wonderful. And that if I can accept that both of those are true, and that I can still be a good human being, even though I've done things that I regret, and we can, do that as individuals and as a nation, that if we can include all of that, that we know that there are things that aren't the best, and we know that there are things that are wonderful. And to be authentic, we really need to be open to all of that rather than
Hmm.
just pointing at the negative or just pointing at the positive and ignoring the wholeness of the story.
Well, I'm thinking about, because I watch a lot of media that is actually made outside of the country, like
Mhm.
France 24, BBC,
Yeah.
DW,
Huh?
in Germany. And I'm amused usually when someone from another country, not the US, will get on and say, "Well, Americans are."
Right, right.
It's just like, oh yeah, okay, really? What are Americans? What are we?
Uh-huh.
And one of the things that has struck me about that is there has been a recognition that, wow, there are some really angry, negative Americans. Like in the beginning, in the last, let's just, without, being specific about the politics, just
Okay.
look at the last, what you want to say, since 2015 or so, there seems to be this gradual recognition that a country that was perceived as very, very positive and forward looking,
Mhm.
all of a sudden is becoming very pessimistic. And to be honest with you, I was, I guess, so typical in my Americanness that I didn't realize that other countries were very pessimistic about their countries. I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah, we were much more on the happy side, yeah.
Yeah, we were much more on the happy side. It's like, damn, why are y'all down on your countries? um, and so, but at the same time, it's like, some people have gone way to the other side and they're thinking, well, Americans are really angry. And I'm just like, well, there are angry Americans, but I don't really think most Americans are angry. I really don't think so. I mean, you might get angry at something in particular right
Yeah.
now, but generally, I don't think Americans are angry. But on the flip side of that, though, to me, recently there was an attempt to sort of portray America as joyous. And I think you know exactly what I mean. And that didn't really feel like a good fit either. Like if you're
Right.
shopping for like clothes or something like that, and you put this shirt on and you're just like, well, these colors don't really fit me.
Yeah.
And it's not like I haven't been in joyous communities in the US. I
Mhm.
have been in joyous communities in the US, Jesus
Yeah,
Christ. I mean, I've
yeah.
been in those communities, but I would not say that the country is joyous. And I thought about that, and I was watching, I think it was a show on DW, and it hit me. The best way I would describe the US is really kind of fun loving.
Yeah.
I think most Americans really just have a very going to the game, going to the movies, let's have a party, eating pizza, hot dogs, and
Mhm.
hamburgers, playing video games. I mean, that very much is not the erudite, positive, noble image,
Right. But it is
but I
fun.
do actually think is accurate.
I do think it is accurate, and, um, it does kinda make Americans seem very shallow when we talk about Americans just wanting to have fun, because I think there's a lot more that goes into the foundation that allows us to have that sense of fun. Like,
Yes.
some of the things that and some of the things that have been breaking down, like when we have a cohesive community or a cohesive nation where we've got safety nets, where you know if something bad's gonna happen, like, your whole life's not gonna go off the rails. If,
Hmm.
there's a certain number of things that are in place that allow you to relax around certain things, relax around just ordinary life so that you can enter into a more buoyant state and have more fun. But a lot of, I think around 2015, actually, I think more like around 2008, with the housing crisis and things
Yes,
like that.
I
And I
totally
noticed a big
agree.
difference at 2000 in 9/11 too.
Hmm.
9/11, we went from this place of, the rest of the world may have problems, but we're doing fine,
Right.
"Oh, wow, maybe there's more to the story that we haven't been paying attention to," and then it
Hmm.
wasn't that much longer that we had sort of the Great Recession and 2008 housing crisis and all this, and all of those foundations that we were taking for granted that allowed us to have fun and not overly worry about life, like, those
Hmm.
have gradually eroded, so I think we still like to have fun, but, it's kind of uneven in our ability to let go of the worries of everyday life to be
Right.
able to have fun, and I think that's where that negativity is coming from, is that, well, I've done all of this my life, I've followed all the rules, I've done everything I'm supposed to do, and look at I'm in wreckage right now, and I've,
Hmm.
gotta go work 6 jobs and all this kind of stuff, and the situation in America has kind of changed to the point that a lot more people are in that struggle mode than had been before, or perceive themselves to be in that struggle mode than before. So fun is, as much as it's still important, is not necessarily like top.
I'm so glad you said that because I specifically remember the moment at around 2008, 9, or 10 when I heard an interview with a woman who literally said, I'd spent my entire life thinking that I couldn't fail. And
Mhm.
by that she meant I went to the school and got the degree,
Yeah.
that basically set my future.
Mhm.
you know, Companies pursued me for jobs, and I basically felt like I could pick or choose whatever job I
Yeah.
want. If I got tired of this job, then I can do the responsible thing and, arrange for a transition.
Mhm.
Maybe the company I'm with now might try to retain me by sweetening the offer or whatever. And she was like, all of a sudden, I was laid off and I
Mhm.
couldn't find a job.
Yeah.
And to your point about like, well, not everyone was living that way. My first thought when I heard
Yeah.
that was, so what else is new?
Right. True.
But you're right that, a larger and larger group of people started
Mhm.
to realize. And I mean, I remember there was like an article about the statement, if you work hard and follow the rules, then you'll have the American dream was a lie.
Yeah.
I remember there was like an article with a title, something like that.
Yeah.
And so I definitely believe that's true. A lot of that started to break down this notion, and it does require for you to have the be comfortable investing large sums of money in something like a movie or like a
Yeah.
sporting event. You have
Yeah.
to have stability in order to do that.
Yeah.
There's just no other way you're going to do it. Like to spend all this money on a stadium
Mhm.
when you have to have like some modicum of stability in that city at least, let alone the
Yeah.
state, to
Yeah.
do that. So I totally agree with you. And then the whole thing about like it makes Americans sound shallow is always an interesting thing to me because from my understanding of it, and I include myself in this, is that really what it is that we don't I mean, I don't feel bound by history or
Mhm.
historical context. Let's put it like
Yeah.
that. I mean, if the idea is good, if this idea is good and that idea is good, it doesn't matter to me that they come from completely different cultures.
Right. Yeah.
They're both good ideas, and they may look even better if you put them together. Now, the
Mhm.
people who are invested in those cultures and invested in that historical context would never put them together because they feel like, well, no, of course, this is not that, and this is better than that.
Right, or they
Whereas,
do have those, like, hundreds of years well, I mean, we've had hundreds of years, but multi-hundreds of years of, like, the same culture and the same language and all this kind of
right,
stuff, and
right, exactly, right.
when I used to travel, people used to ask me, and this speaks to this a little bit, "How come Americans are always smiling? They always say hi." And I said, "Well, if you think about America, people," and they were well, I won't get into that part, that people in America, like, they left what was comfortable. They left the old country, whatever that old country happened to be, and so when you
Mhm.
come to a new place, like, you have to make that community, and you have to
Mhm.
make your community in usually a diverse community. I mean, sometimes you can come and find, people who are similar to you, but you have to come in a diverse community, and so, to be forward friendly, whether it's with a hello or a smile or forging, because Americans are also known for forging friendships fairly quickly, even
Mhm.
if they seem like they're more shallow. Well, and part of that is building your community, like the basic network of your community to build on.
Mhm.
In other countries, you might be stuck in a caste system. You might, your last name might have a meaning that automatically keeps you out of certain things or automatically includes you in certain things. Like you might not have the freedom to choose new communities as easily as you can here. And so I
Mhm.
would explain that to people that, that when people came to America, it was a constant building of community and to be friendly and to be buoyant and to be, even if it's shallow friendships, to make those connections was
Mhm.
really important. It was survival. And
Mhm.
so to try to explain why, even though it seems shallow in other places, why it was very important and continues to be important here.
Yeah, well, and the other thing is if they're talking about Americans that came to their country, they're talking about Americans who have a lot of reason to smile because they're not worried about other things. They're not talking about somebody who's struggling to pay the bills.
No, but they're also in media, because American media sort of proliferates
Oh,
around the world.
yes,
So
that's
movies and
true.
TV and all of that stuff, like, we're smiling, we're saying hi, usually
That
we have
is
nice
true.
car.
I
I
mean,
mean, all the stuff like
we're even doing it right now. I
yeah.
mean, we probably weren't smiling all day long.
No,
And if
because your
some
mouth hurt. But in interaction, it's a natural thing for Americans to do generally. I mean, it's
That's right.
weird if you're
Yeah.
talking to somebody and they're not smiling, like, you think, like, should I call somebody? What's the problem? Because we're just
Mhm.
so naturally that's how we relate to each other.
Right.
And
That is true. That is
yeah.
true. So yeah, I mean that's definitely my idea, which is that whatever the news story is, it has to kind of have almost like this. I mean, I can't think of another way to say it. Almost like how in video games, the video game kind of presents the world as like this spectacular. Like
Mhm.
if you think about Marvel movies and the world that Thor comes from, this spectacular, gigantic, impressive world
Mhm.
with, it's optimistic in the sense that they expect it to be that way at least,
Right.
you know. It's going to, the possibilities are endless and all this other kind of stuff. And I don't know that a story that would resonate as broadly as we needed to would necessarily be very normative laden in terms of this is the way things should be or that's the way things should
Right.
be. I think it should be very future focused.
Yeah, I mean, because there was always that idea, I know you probably got it growing up in school too, that America was less of a country and more of an idea, like it's
Right.
an ever-evolving idea,
Right.
and so if we had, like, a story that really had a unifying idea that left room for everybody to have their own experience within that idea, that it is consistently and constantly continuing to evolve rather than a story that's like a static story that we all have to fit into. Because
Mhm.
that's the whole American dream story, and even the revolution story. The revolution story that was long enough ago, but we all kind of have to find ourselves in the revolution. Of course, we're on the side of the Americans and overthrowing the government or the British, but in
Mhm.
the American dream, like, this was the story, and if you followed the rules, then you could too also put yourself into that story versus
Mhm.
it being a living story that you and your experience contribute to as a player in that story that we're continuing to evolve together.
Mhm.
And that the aspiration within that story is not like the American dream that, you've got to do all these things and then things will work out for you. But are you part of a larger story and conversation with your experience that helps to increase and improve all of us together?
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting. I actually think that the fun-loving America, it would have the broadest appeal, but the people that it wouldn't necessarily appeal to are the ideological folks, of which I am one, actually.
And I've got my own bunch of that, but that's the same thing. Like if you haven't an idea or an ideology or a story that you want people to fit into, but you can flip an ideology on its head. Like, like what's your ideology? When you talk about yourself as an ideologist, what does that mean for you?
I think it's absolutely absurd that a person can claim on their taxes that they make $80,000 a year, while at the same time spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year because they're borrowing against the hundreds of billions of dollars that they're not touching. They're not
Yeah,
touching that hundreds of billions
right.
of dollars, but they're borrowing against that money for the express purpose of not paying taxes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just absurd on its face. It's just
Mhm.
absurd on its face. But the only reason why nobody really thinks about it is because it's the system's sort of been designed to allow that. I've even seen interviews with people where the person I'm talking about is Jeff Bezos, who
Mhm.
claims that he made $80,000 every year, and he even took like a $4,000 child tax credit because he's entitled to. His income is only $80,000.
Right. Yeah.
And yet the man could actually rent Venice for his wedding, right? So yeah, that's my ideology. I think that's
Okay, and that
absurd.
is a finance trick, and if you haven't heard of that, you people listening, that is a real finance trick. It's a real thing. It's breaking down now a little bit because some of the valuations on those fortunes are changing, and so there's some margin calls coming in that are wiping some people out. So there's a little bit of karma there. But yeah, that truly is. But so, what is the driving value of that? Is it fairness? Is it like what is that? What is that? That is the little flower at the
I mean,
heart of.
if I'm honest, I would say retribution because I actually do identify that structure is
Mhm.
the cause of a lot of the psychoses that we're dealing with. It's kind of like you have a crazy thing that's sort of resonating in an area, but just because people don't recognize it and they can't see it like a
Mhm.
sound or a smell or a gas or something, doesn't mean it's not driving everybody a little bit insane.
Right, but there's, like so if you were to look at a positive value in terms of a human story, we could talk about it in terms of integrity,
Well, that's true. That's
uh,
true.
you know, something along those lines, 'cause that's a very positive,
Mhm.
expansionary value, where retribution's a little bit more of that, like, we'll just keep batting that tennis ball back and forth
Right.
until
Yep.
the tennis ball wears away, same song, next verse, which is kind of what we've been doing for the last 250 years.
Oh,
So
yeah, I know.
if
Well, that's
if
the
we
that's the
create a
reason
new.
why I came up with Colosseum. That's what Colosseum is all
Yeah,
about.
well, I know, yeah, so it should read. But if you had an aspirational value that people can look at, like integrity means different things to different people. But if you were living
True.
a life
That
of
is true.
integrity, that is actually a self-feeding, self-supporting, self-nourishing value.
Mhm.
Because where retribution is actually a stressful value that steals your own resources because it puts you into a stress state, which puts you into a resource depletion state. And even though it feels powerful in the moment because it generates adrenaline, adrenaline is a stealer of body resources over time. So where integrity is one of those things that, because of the buoyancy of integrity, it helps to support your body, it helps to nourish you, it helps to carry you forward, it gives you energy. So if you think about it in terms of how does it work in your body,
Mm.
retribution is a depletion, it's an adrenaline fueled depletion state. Where something
Mhm.
like integrity, if it's a positive value within you, is a self self-expanding, healing, nourishing state.
No, I understand what you're saying. It's like the difference between having a glass of water and having a glass of wine, but I happen to
Right.
like wine.
I know, but if you want so for me, when it comes to values, like if I have values that are pitting me against,
Mhm.
that's not something that actually serves me or feeds me or I think serves a country.
Oh,
I
no,
mean, we
no.
wanna
Intellectually
recognize
intellectually,
that.
I am 100% with you,
Yeah. But
intellectually.
retribution, I mean, retribution's fun. I gotta admit, and it feels zinging in the body. It's a kind of cool thing. But
Mhm.
in terms of a story carrying us forward, finding things like integrity and some of these other things are not glossy pictures,
Right.
but sort of values that we can find self-support and mutual support in.
Mhm.
Um, that it doesn't require that everybody be the same. So
No, no, no,
everybody
no.
has an integrity.
And that's the reason why, like, I'm able to recognize, like I said, that it would need another name, but fun loving
Mhm.
is a story that essentially can be summed up as fun loving, or a characterization that can be summed up as fun loving is one that I think would appeal to
Mm-hmm.
the majority of people. Whereas, and I'm just being honest, people like me, we would have to learn to embrace that, although ideologically we still kind of stick to our particular position because that position is natural to us,
Mm-hmm.
you know. Um, I have definitely come to appreciate how we do have a large number of people who are not ideological in the country.
Mm-hmm.
It can be
Yeah.
frustrating as an ideological person. It's just like, oh, what do you mean you don't get it? You really, you don't get it? It's like, how could you vote for that reason and not this reason? Like, really? But I'm just being honest. That's
Mm-hmm.
just the way I am. And so sometimes I can relate to the other side, the ideology on the other side more than
Mm-hmm.
the middle, who are just like, look, I'm just thinking about these lists of very concrete things.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, actually, the guy over there who I disagree with, I get where he's coming from.
Well, and I think the fun-loving people that are the ones that are kind of turning negative to me because they've always been fairly positive, but
That's true.
as they have found their life not to match up with what they have been led to believe it
What
should
they've
be.
grown used to. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they might
Yeah.
not be ideological, and the way that they experience that is by becoming, more negative or
Cynical,
cynical.
nihilistic. Yeah, that's true.
Without
Yeah.
necessarily attaching it to this or this, which is why I think we end up sort of doing the ping pong back and forth. Well, we don't
Hmm.
like this, so we're gonna vote for this because it's not this, but then we don't like
Hmm.
that, so then we're gonna bounce back over here versus, something like a story or values where what do we want? What is
Hmm.
something that we choose that we want, and how do we move toward what we want instead of just reacting to what we don't want? Because that's never worked.
So
And
that brings me back to the idea that I threw out to you because, the thing about that idea, because I'm not part of, these, but definitely the religious communities.
Mhm.
I've been a member of a Unitarian Universalist church, but if you're familiar with Unitarian Universalism, that's not actually surprising. It's to me, it's an opportunity for, again, that big loving group, because it's not like they don't value anything. I mean,
No.
non-material, they do actually,
Right,
especially if you
they do.
give them an opportunity to kind of think about it and say, you know what, I just really think children should be able to go to school without worrying about their parents
Mhm.
being snatched up or something like that. I
Yeah.
just really
Yeah.
think that's important.
Yeah.
And so when you give them an opportunity to do that, what you wind up doing is you wind up with this almost movement of people who don't start from an ideological place, who
Mhm.
wind up kind of pushing the ideologies on either side kind of to the side, like they
Mhm.
truly are
Yeah.
outliers, making them clearly the outliers that they are in reality. If you look at the numbers, they
Yeah.
have the intensity,
True.
which
Yeah.
makes them look bigger than, makes us look
Yeah.
bigger than they are. But you just don't have a lot of people who are you ask me what my ideology is, and boom, I hit you with Bezos. You're just not going to have a lot of people who are going to do that.
No, no, because yeah, you have to really pay attention to a lot of things to put all those together to be able to come up with that one.
And be angry about it
And be
specifically.
angry about it, yeah, yeah. I think if people understood that whole scheme, they would be really angry about it
Yes, they
because,
would. They would. I mean, it's
it
it's just a basic question. It's like, if
it
you
is
make eighty
breaking
eighty
up
thousand
the
dollars, how much
yeah,
money do you think you realistically can spend in a year? And
yeah,
most people would say, maybe 120,000 without going
mhm,
into too much debt. No, imagine 700 million.
yeah.
What? you know. So you're bringing me down to going down the
Uh,
ideological path.
but but because I think it as much as there are the ideological people and they are, on both sides and they're loud and they have got lots of bots on both sides and so everything
Mhm.
is amplified and more people like have just sort of checked out. So
That's true.
it's the arguments of the ideologues and everybody else is just like, yeah, leave me alone. I'm like, I don't look at
I don't want to participate in that yelling match.
yeah, I look at some things, but I've got my quieter things I look at because I don't wanna disrupt my zen because that's how I keep my center.
I hear you.
So, I think, I always talk about the muddle in the middle or the 80% in the middle, you got the loud ends, but the people in the middle are the ones that don't really have a voice. So I
That's
think it's
true.
not a
Yeah.
bad idea to be able to get people give people that voice. Because when they do polls and things, you do find out that those people in the middle, like, they don't have the same values as the people on the edges, and people on
No,
the edge
no,
and
no.
what's important to them are the core, how do we all live together in a way that
Hmm.
is reasonably fair and reasonably supportive of everybody, and everybody gets to participate in, and that our children can be safe, and
Hmm.
that our old people aren't shuffled off into old folks homes to die on Medicaid or whatever.
Hmm.
Whatever those just ordinary human values are, like, that's something that I think everybody wants to co-opt on the edges, but the people who are in the middle are trying to figure out, how do we do that, how do we
Yeah, I
make that.
agree. Okay, well, I'm looking at there's a clock above the thing that I'm
Oh,
looking at, and it says 59 minutes.
okay.
I think this is a good place to kind of end it. We had planned to have this conversation, a conversation like this, like every other week on
Yep,
Fridays.
believe so.
Okay.
Yeah,
Hopefully at around 3 o'clock.
that
So,
sounds.
for whoever has actually stuck around to listen to this conversation, we really appreciate you.
Mhm.
This is the first time, so I'm going to go back and kind of get a sense of what that is. And then we're also going to publish, since we're both on Substack and other social media, we're going to publish this video and shoot it out so people can watch it later on if they want to. Again, my name is Henry L. Sullivan III. I'm author of the novel Colosseum, which I've kind of talked a little bit about. You've definitely gotten a flavor of it.
And I'm Christine Madera, author of God and Drag, also a novel, and, yeah, I'm sure you'll hear about it more at other times. So, it's been great having this conversation, though.
Yes, it has. It has. So, all right. So I guess we'll see you again in 2 weeks.